My name is Christopher Kelly, and I'm a master beekeeper and the owner of North Fork Promised Land Apiaries out here in Mattituck, New York. I want to talk to you today about one of my favorite things, which is about starting and keeping bees. As a master beekeeper, I've been keeping bees here on Long Island and in New York for almost 50 years. I've been a professional beekeeper, I've been a hobbyist beekeeper, and I've traveled the world doing bees. So today, I'd like to share with you what does it involve to get started in beekeeping and what you can do to keeping the bees safely. So I always start with the very first thing is, what is it going to cost to start up a beehive? And there's really three components to keeping bees. First, there is the cost of the bees themselves, which typically runs about $250. The second is what I call the hard goods, or the materials that you have to get to house those bees in. And that can start at about $250 per hive and go upward. The nice thing about it is that equipment is a one-time purchase, and in continuing years you will not need to repurchase that equipment. And then the third is what we call your personal protective gear, which involves the veil, the jacket, maybe gloves, smoker, and hive tools. And then there is hive maintenance through the year, and what we talk about with that is you do have to feed your bees through the course of the years during the spring and summertime in Long Island. You also have to treat your bees for various diseases and pests that come across. And finally, there's an option about requeening your hive in the fall. I would suggest that you not do that as a beginner, but rather that's something you would look at in your second year of keeping bees. So you're really looking at a range, and I think I have 570 to almost 700. I really think it's really more like $800 to $1,000 per beehive as your initial startup cost. The next thing I like to really cover is that site location is probably the most important thing that you're going to do when you start to set up your beehive. How much land? Bees don't take up much space. A beehive itself only takes up maybe a 3-foot square area. But that having been said, typically the rule of thumb is you should not have more than 3 or 4 hives per acre of land on it. And the key elements that I'd like you to consider when thinking about where do I place my beehive is sun exposure, wind protection, and a clean water source. The next question you want to ask yourself is, can the location I'm considering support your bees? What types of flowers, flowering trees, and shrubs are in your area? Know your honey plants. I think it's a good time to do it. What I'd like you to consider is, if you went on Google Map or Google Earth and put a pin on where the location of your beehives are going to be and draw a 1-mile radius, that will give you a real idea about where 95% of your bees are going to travel in. And when you look at it, you're going to see whether you have bodies of open water, whether you have farms, woods, or high density subdivisions. It gives you an idea of what is in your area. The other thing is just check your local town ordinances. Most towns do not have a restriction about you keeping bees at your house, but there may be restrictions if you live within a town about if you can keep bees at all in there. And the other thing I put this out is, make sure you're not allergic to bee stings, or if you are, please go in there with full knowledge of that bees can sting and you could get hurt. Neighbors. Neighbors are definitely a concern throughout most of Long Island. And the distance that you need to keep from your property line to your neighbors, I think you need a minimum of 5 feet away from the border. But more importantly, what I suggest is that you put either a hedge and or a fence to obscure the direct view of the beehives from your neighbor. It accomplishes two things. One, out of sight is out of mind. But the second part is that bees normally like to fly at about a 30-inch height level. When you place a hedge, that hedge should be anywhere from 4 to 6 feet. And what it does is it forces the bees to fly upward. And when they fly upward, they're out of the line of sight and out of the direct path of any neighbors. The second thing that I like you to really take a look at is sunlight. When do the bees get sun and when are they in shade? Now, bees are very, very adaptable. So sunlight, to me, I actually am more concerned about winter sunlight, because in the cold days of December like we're at now, winter temperatures can go low and the bees are not flying. So the winter sun can help heat the hive up a little bit and help keep them warmer through the winter months. In the summer, I don't mind if my hives are in complete shade, because the ambient temperature is warm enough for them. The more important thing, and it's true whether it's in spring, summer, or winter, or fall, is wind protection. Out here on the east end of Long Island, our west and our northerly exposures need to have a really good wind protection. And again, a hedge or a fence of 4 to 6 foot high actually will achieve that purposes. In fact, if you took a look at this picture where this bee yard is, that's literally a 6 foot snow fence. And on it, it actually has an awful lot of vine growth that is growing against it. And that vine growth acts as a really good wind protector. And the other thing that you need to remember when starting a beehive is bees need water, particularly in the months of July and August. They use a lot of water to help cool the beehive during the heat of summer. This year I've had a bee yard that was in at a farm, and I did not have a source of clean water for them. And within about 3 weeks in July, I got a call from the owner saying the bees were coming to their pool. When I added a water source for them, I stopped the problem. But I should have known that well before I ever put them in. The thing is you don't have to have the water source right on top of them, just it needs to be within 100 yards of them. The next decision that you come to is when you start to Google and look up a whole lot about bee equipment, there's two main sizes. One is called an 8 frame and the other is called a 10 frame. What that talks about, if you look at this cutout of the bee equipment, is within that box. So let's look at the reference to Deep Super. And you look at the cutout in that box, it has a number of frames. 8 frame or 10 frames can fit. The smaller size is 8 frame, the larger size is a 10 frame beehive. Okay? You have a lot of modular components to the hive. You have the bottom board, a hive stand, deep queen excluder, and then your honey supers, and then an inner and outer covers. All of these components are what make up a complete hive. I'm going to just go back for a second to this bee yard, and you look here, these are examples of 10 frame beehives, and they have 2 deep boxes, and you can see the lid, the outer cover. You can't see the inner cover, which is inside. And I like to put a rock on top of them to keep the possibility of the wind blowing the top off. I put this in here because bee equipment gets very heavy when it's full with honey and full with bees. One of these 10-frame deep supers, full with bees and full with honey, can weigh almost 90 pounds. And for those of us that are not quite that strong, we may not want to carry that much weight. So that the consideration might be to go to an 8-frame, which would max out at about 70 pounds. The other thing is that beekeeping has a whole lot of different terms for equipment. And there's strange words we call deeps. Deeps can be called brood chambers or hive bodies, deep supers. Interchangeable words, all meaning the same thing. They're the biggest box there is. Mediums are exactly like what it sounds like. It's a medium size, it's a box smaller than the deep, but larger than what we call shallows. Shallows are the smallest of these boxes. We have a term in beekeeping that we call supers. Supers are what we call each of these individual boxes. There's some real interest now when you go onto the web and you can look up something called the flow hive. The flow hive is really a cool, remarkable invention. I don't recommend that you start with it in your first year or two of beekeeping, because I think it's really important you learn the general basics and management of a beehive first before you get into a different way of managing bees through the flow hive. And then the last portion of this thought is that one of the equipment pieces you're going to buy is a feeder for the beehive. And that type of feeder is what you want to think about as well. Frames. These movable frames, okay, they can be wood, they can be plastic. The examples in here, the slide on the upper one is that's a all-in-one. That's a plastic frame, and the foundation is what is inside the four walls of the frame. That is a case of all plastic. The one on top of the deep super is a wood frame with a plastic foundation. One of the advantages of plastic frames is simply this: you don't have any assembly required, and they're really easy to clean. You can take an old frame, scrape it free of any beeswax, clean it up, and reuse it. The problem with plastic is it does lose its tensile strength, and it starts to soften and warp over a period of time. And the other part is that straight plastic, the bees are very reluctant to begin what we call draw or start to build on that comb. My personal favorite, because I am old school, is I like wood frames. I like that they smell good. The foundation I typically use is pure beeswax because the bees will draw or build their comb on that foundation much easily. The problem with it is twofold. One is it is time consuming to build those frames, add the foundation, and get it set up. A typical frame like that takes anywhere from 9 to 12 minutes per frame to have it all set up and ready for the bees. The other disadvantage is, should the hive get a disease, you actually have to burn these frames. Okay, feeders. These are some examples of feeders. The one on the left, that's like a 1-gallon bucket feeder, which you invert it. You can add your sugar syrup. You've got to the right of that, you've got this top feeder, the one right here, this top feeder with slats. This is a different form of top feeders. And then the two down here are in frames. You can replace a frame with the feeder. And then we have what we call entrance feeders, and these are ones that you place in the entrance so they're outside of the hive, and when they're empty you can actually take them off and refill them. And then the next question comes on this, when you start to Google up, well, what kind of bees should I buy? Look, for all intent and purposes, when you start to Google, you're going to get overwhelmed. There must be, if I said there were 30 different strains of bees you could buy, it gets confusing very quickly. For the purposes of beginning beekeeping, I would say to stick to one of three strains: the Italians, the Carniolans, or the Caucasians. And here's the pros and cons. The Italian strain was and actually still is kind of the mainframe strain of honeybees used in America. It used to be in excess of 95% of the bees were the Italians, and the reason was easy. They're excellent honey producers, they're easy to handle, they're great to look at. Their problem is actually threefold now. They are prolific, what we call brood rearers. That means they rear lots of young bees. That's great when you have honey flow going on. It's not so great when you don't have any honey coming in and they still have mouths to feed. They use up their honey stores very quickly. The other problem with the Italians is that when there is no honey coming in, they can become aggressive robbers of other hives and can get aggressive towards you in terms of temperament. And the final thing is that the Italians are not well suited or adapted to dealing with Varroa mite, which is probably the single biggest issue you're going to deal with when you get managing your bees. With the Carniolans are great. They're kind of a very dark colored bee. They have an explosive spring buildup, which works very well for us here on Long Island. Again, they're easy to handle, and what I really like about them is they're very good comb builders. The one negative that stands out for them is that they're prone to swarming. Swarming is where the bees naturally reproduce. As a beekeeper, I love my swarms, but my neighbor may not like 4,000, 10,000 bees in his bush, okay? And then there's the Caucasian. The Caucasian is actually an interesting bee because it truly looks kind of a grayish, a silvery gray color. One of the things about it is actually the one that has documented the longest proboscis, which is their tongue, which allows them to actually source some flowers that neither the Italian nor the Carniolans can. The trouble with them is something called excessive propolis buildup. And propolis is the bee glue that the bees use to seal the hive from wind, from predators and pests. And when they use a lot of that, it's very hard to work that hive with all that glue on there. And the other kind of negative, and it is a negative here on Long Island, they're slow to build up in spring. What that means to you as the beekeeper is that the bees will not maximize catching the honey plants that are available for them. And then you come to the next decision. Once you've decided what strain of bees, and by the way, you can always buy a hybrid, Italian Carniolan crosses, things like that. They will work very well for you. But here's what you've got a choice on. You can choose either a package of bees or what we call a nuke. A package of bees is an artificial swarm, okay? And what does that look like? For a package of bees, first point is they typically start at a cheaper price point than a nuke. There's no frame exchange and no nuke box to return. And typically when we sell a package of bees, we sell them by the pound. You typically will get 2 to 3 pounds of bees with what we call a live mated queen. The cons with the package are that they have no brood. They are starting from literally scratch. And so from the time you put the bees in a hive to the time that you actually start to see a growth in your hive is 4 to 6 weeks. And if the queen, that live queen, fails, then you could be in very serious trouble very quickly. And in my opinion, when starting bees as a beginner here on Long Island, it makes no sense for you to start with the package because of this delay of the package coming up to speed and it missing the opportune window of our flowers out here. With the nuke, a nuke is exactly like it sounds. It's literally a starter colony. And one of the things is when you get them, I sell 5-frame nukes. They are loaded with bees, loaded with brood, which is all the stages that they're growing. The queen is laying, and they're set to go. And when you put them into your full-size hive, that explosive growth they take right off. The problem with them is cost, okay? When you look at the pricing of nukes versus packages, typically a nuke runs anywhere from $80 to $100 more expensive than a package. And the other problem is that many people don't like to work with what I call deep frames, deep supers, and nukes typically come only in deep frames. So what I'd like to encourage you if you're watching today is as you're getting ready to get into bees, the first thing I want to encourage you is read. And you can do that obviously online. You can Google ad nauseum. I would also suggest that you try to find a mentor if you've got someone in the area that has been keeping bees for a long while. You ask whether or not you might be able to, he or she might be able to help you. Choose your site and prepare it. In other words, if you need to level it. If you need to put a hedge or a fence up, get that all in place. When you set up your hives, and this is one of the recommendations I always make, is always start with 2 bee hives. Bees are a lot like, they each have a different personality. And sometimes you're going to get a hive that's very aggressive and very forward, and then you get one that's kind of weak and lazy. But the other thing is bees are also competitive. So 2 hives placed in the same spot actually helps both of them remain competitive. Typically, we like to see that these hives are a minimum of 5 feet apart, and even better would be 10 feet apart. A lot of this has to do with protecting the beehives from what we call drift. We don't want bees floating from one hive to the other. The other thing is you select your equipment now. Get your equipment ordered. You can get it over the winter. There's no pressure in how quickly you have to put it together. All the equipment around here probably needs to be painted. I personally do not have any preference in terms of paint color. In fact, I have every paint color under the sun, all the way from unpainted, untreated, to all the way to black. The thing is that if you're going to start in bees, you need to order actually now. I tell this story when I first started in beekeeping. You used to be able to call the breeder in late April or in beginning of April, and they would send it to you in late April. You don't do that anymore. If you haven't ordered your bees by about the 1st of January, maybe even into February, you probably won't get any. I'd also encourage you that if in your studies, you should join the Long Island Beekeepers Club and or take a beginner's beekeeping class, because all I have done today is done a rough overview of what it costs, what it takes to get started into the beekeeping world. One of the other questions that comes quite frequently to me is, how much time does managing 2 beehives take? It doesn't take a lot of time. It typically, what I say, is 1 hour per week from the time you install the bees till about October 1st. Once you get into October 1st, it's probably only an hour every other week. And then in the winter, it's even less time. That being said, what I do say is, a lot of times, once you've started keeping your bees, you tend to spend a lot of time watching your bees because they are such a delight to do. So, in the beekeeping calendar, what is our timeline? And this is what the timeline is. In springtime, my bees should arrive anywhere from April 15th to June 1st. And when your bees arrive, you should install them literally as soon as possible. If they arrive in the evening, you can certainly leave them at the location where you're going to install them overnight and put them in the morning. I would only make up a sugar syrup solution about 2 to 3 days before I knew the nuke was going to arrive. And then, what am I looking at? Once a beehive, I'm just going to go very quickly through this. This is not meant to be detailed. This is a one-off general overview of starting in bees, how I get started, what I do. Like I said, you could take some of my beginner beekeeping classes that I give at Agway to get a much more in-depth thing. Because when I look at a honeybee life cycle, honeybee's life cycle is an insect life cycle, which means there's 4 stages. There's the egg, the larvae, the pupae, and the adult. This is what an egg looks like. It's a tiny little sliver. As I get older, it's harder and harder for me to see it at the bottom. The second is, this is the ugly duckling stage. This is the bee larvae. And then this is just a frame that shows you eggs and larvae. And then when you see this light chocolate capping, this is what the pupae. That's the pupae is the metamorphosis, the transformational stage. That's where it goes from ugly duckling into those beautiful adults that you see there, the adult workers and drones. Drones are the males of the beehives. And I put this frame in purposely because you see the difference in the drone brood. It looks like bullets coming out. Here's worker brood. Here's drone brood. And if you look on the center, in about the center of the hive, you can see that big fat guy, the full eyes on the head. That's a drone. And the littler ones are the worker bees. Something that you're going to need to understand as a beekeeper is the caste system of the bees. The workers, 21 days from egg to adult. The drones are 24 days, and the queen is 14 to 16 days. The queen is the only fertile female in the entire hive. There's only 1 queen per hive. The workers are sterile females, and they do virtually all the work in the beehive to keep it going. That means they do all the foraging, they do all the brood rearing, all the comb building, and they will defend the hive. And the drones, who do not have any stingers, are the only males in the hive, and their sole purpose in life is to mate with virgin queens. They do not overwinter with the beehives. In fact, back in about October, we start to see the massacre of drones because they get tossed out of the beehives as cold weather sets in. This is what the workers look like, and you can see they're very well adapted to do all the inner workings of the hive. This is what a drone looks like. And this is actually a real good one here because you can see the real difference. You see the drones with the gigantic eyes, big wide body, then the worker bees. And you note that the queen on the far right there on me, that queen has that long, slender abdomen. That's an abdomen that is full of eggs, that she will be laying eggs for her entire life. Here's another picture of a queen. And one of the things I like about this one is that you take a look at the attendant courts. In other words, the bees surrounding her all have their antennas towards her, and what they are doing is they literally are attending to her every need. Next thing you actually have to understand is bees have a very simple diet. They eat nectar and they eat pollen. Nectar is the liquid reward that are from the flowers of the plants that the bees visit. Pollen is the protein source. Actually, the proteins, fats, and minerals. Nectar from the plants is transformed into honey by the bees. How that happens is two steps. One is the bees ingest it, and when it's ingested they add an enzyme called invertase, which cuts the sugar molecules. When the nectar is placed into the honeycomb, it is then they evaporate off the water, so it goes from 50-50 water sugar to literally 18% water and 82% sugar. Here's a nice frame to show you of what pollen looks like in the slide here. This is a full frame of pollen, and on the far one you can see there's a band of pollen right next to what we call that sealed brood. I love this picture because this is a classic picture of bees gathering pollen. And when this bee does it, if you take a look at its entire body, it's all kind of got fur or hairs, and it's got all sorts of pollen grains. These pollen grains get transferred from flower to flower, and that's how something called pollination happens, and that's how you end up with all the fresh fruits and vegetables that we have. When we look at a frame, this is a honey frame. If you take a look at it closely, you can see that there is liquid, and this is what we call unripe honey at this point. All right. We call it ripe honey or honey that is ready when we see this. You see the white cappings on top. That's pure beeswax that has sealed that cell of honey. Kept in this state, as long as you don't get moisture or rodents into it, honey is virtually indestructible and lasts a very, very long time. One thing is you as a beekeeper are going to learn about in your managing of your beehives is swarming. And this is how bees reproduce. Usually occurs in the spring. I typically like to use the holiday Mother's Day. That is typically a high point around here for when bees swarm. It's triggered by when there are too many bees in the hive, and the old queen will leave with up to 2/3 of the bees into a new location. This was a hive of bees I got called for in my hometown of Mattatuck, and you see that big swarm of bees. That's about 3 pounds of bees. That's about 12,000 bees. Within, somewhere in the center of that, was the queen in there. This is me taking that swarm out of the tree. What I did is I cut the branch, and then you see how I cut the branch, and then just literally shook them into that box, and they went marching right on in. It was probably one of my more favorite swarm removals. In the summer or fall, when you start to say, well, how often do I check? Every 10 days. Best time, just think of the weather. If you're comfortable, your bees are probably comfortable. 70 degrees, sunny, warm. And I'm using this as benchmarks. This is not etched in stone. What you're always inspecting your hive for, and I hammer this home to my bee students, are my queen right? And what we mean by queen right is, did I see eggs? or did I actually see the queen? Second is I look for how much honey, how much pollen is in that hive. That's the food stores. And the third thing, of course, we treat or observe for diseases. Because crazy part about out here is we have to start our winter preparation for bees in August. And bees need at least 60 pounds of honey to overwinter. One rule of thumb is if your beehive starts to seem that it's not okay, in other words, it gets very aggressive tempered, starts to sting you indiscriminately when you're not even in the hive, if the hive doesn't smell right, something's off. Because a real hive will smell like a floral bouquet. I teach my students about flight patterns. What does it look like when the bees are coming in and out of the hive? If the flight looks like loosey-goosey, lazy, something is not right. Bees fly with a purpose, and when they fly with a purpose, they are fast and eager. So again, the other thing is if you go in that hive, you see no eggs or what we call an erratic brood pattern. You have to identify it, and the three big things are disease, queen failure, and varroa mites. When you identify which one those are, then if it's a disease, you treat if possible. If it's queen failure, you requeen. And varroa mites, you monitor through the season and treat accordingly. Okay? And then in the winter, what we do is we reduce our hive size, we ensure we've got plenty of food. I like to, this yard is exposed, so what I would have done is actually wrap both of these hives in insulator. Moisture is a huge killer of bees, and I've come to really recognize and advise that you use a quilt box in the winter to help wick away moisture. Ventilation, believe it or not, is very important for the bees, and insulation. So my advice to you is this: enjoy your bees and let them teach you about your area. Embrace the interdependence of plants, insects, and you. Reap the rewards of caring for such special creatures, honey, pollen, and wax. And I'll tell you this, I know you're hooked when everywhere you look you're wondering if my bees could be there. Happy beekeeping. I'd like to add in the back of this, there's some resources here. It's the Long Island Beekeepers.org, great website. There's the EasternApicultural.org. Of course, Cornell Cooperative Extension. I've included my contact details and my email address as well. There are a lot of additional resources out there, but you do need some guidance. Well, I hope I've got you interested in keeping bees and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.